Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I'll tell you why the Timberwolves are not one of the three worst general manager front office jobs in the league. Prominent podcast suggested the Wolves might be the third worst possible GM job. That's not true. Not even close. We'll talk all about all that on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA, and when you enter the promo code LockedOnNBA, they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Happy Thursday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. This show, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts, are available there. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Again, download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and also at my account, which is at Beecken. And that's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. I'm a little bit, I don't know, fired up is maybe strong. I was bothered by the Ryen Russillo podcast on the Ringer Network the other day. And I don't usually spend a whole episode just like talking about another podcast, but that's what we're going to do today. Sorry, it was the Bill Simmons podcast with Ryen Russillo as the guest. I know they're on each other's podcasts all the time. Obviously both at the Ringer. And in general, like, I don't want to do the whole, like, is Simmons a good basketball mind? Is Russillo a good basketball mind thing? In general, I think Simmons he's hot takey because that's his job, but he has some actual basketball knowledge, obviously. And Ryen Russillo, I think I mostly enjoy listening to him as a podcaster. I think that they went a little bit off the rails with their, and again, I get that this was to grab headlines, and here I am talking about it on my show. So, anyway, on the Bill Simmons podcast on, I think it was Monday of this week, and it's just kind of like now hit my ears during the middle part of the week, and I finally was like, I just got to talk about this. Simmons had Russillo on the show to talk about the basically teams that you wouldn't want to be a general manager of. I tried to not listen to this. I tried to not, but I had to, and now I got to talk about it. And they had a draft of like worst GM, essentially worst GM jobs, and or worst situations, I guess, where you would not want to be a general manager. And the Simmons stuff goes way back. Remember, way back in the mid aughts, I guess, or whatever. He led when he was still at ESPN, Simmons did his page 2 column where he campaigned unofficially to be the Timberwolves' next general manager, and then they hired David Kahn, and then he had this vendetta against Kahn, and obviously David Kahn was a disaster. But so there's been kind of this long-standing Simmons Wolves kind of tired trope in a sense. But Russillo was the one who took a swipe at the Wolves. And so the first pick was Charlotte by Ryen Russillo as the worst current general manager situation. Simmons took the Bulls second, which I thought was I understand Charlotte first. The Bulls second is like, they're probably a bottom 5 situation right now. But you factor in market size and, upside and some of those things. It's the cap situation is not great, but second is aggressive, I thought. Then Russillo came in and admitted this was a surprising pick, which is kind of the tell that, like, hey, here we are for, it's listens, clicks, whatever. Obviously, that's where we're at. But they pick, or Russillo picks Minnesota as the third worst general manager job. So what I want to do is I want to start by explaining why they're not, and then talk about teams that are definitely worse. A little similar to the conversation a week and a half ago, I think it was, John Hollinger at The Athletic talked about teams with no cap flexibility. He talked, or most stuck teams, I think was the way he called it. And I talked about how the Wolves were kind of stuck, but not really if they pivot and trade Karl-Anthony Towns. That's part of my rebuttal here. But even if you don't trade Karl-Anthony Towns, I do not understand why anyone in the right mind would think that the Timberwolves have the third worst GM job in the league. Like the third worst. By that, I'm not saying like current, like the way the job has played out, like the worst what am I trying to say? Like Tim Connolly's done the worst job. That's not what they're saying. They're saying like where you would not want to be the GM or the president of basketball operations. So here's why that's wrong. Well, first of all, these other teams don't have the level. Well, actually, the Bulls kind of do. I mean, between Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan, you could argue about level of star power. And the Hornets obviously have LaMelo Ball. But like the Timberwolves have 3 bona fide all-stars, current all-stars, or players who have been all-stars in the last 2 years on their team. And they have one in Jaden McDaniels, who's very likely going to be an all-defensive player next year and is, a few more shots a game away from being in the conversation for an all-star game because he's so good defensively. How could the Timberwolves be in the conversation? How could any team with 2 All-NBA players, a multi-time All-Defensive Player of the Year, a couple of max players, a player who both Simmons and Russillo would say is, I believe in their trade value podcast around this, or last, I guess would have been last offseason, they had Edwards like in the top 12 most, largest, best trade assets in the league. How could you possibly say this is a bottom 3 GM job? How could you possibly argue that? I know that the salaries are crazy for Gobert and they become really crazy for Karl-Anthony Towns. But in a minute here, I'm going to go through some of the teams that I would say are certainly a worse situation. And they don't have superstar caliber players, all-stars already on the team. They're searching for them. Plus, add into that, yes, Gobert and Towns are currently all NBA caliber players and all-star caliber players, but you have a 21-year-old who doesn't yet have the max extension, who's already an all-star. So not only are you good now, and yeah, 42 wins isn't super exciting. The 8th seed isn't super exciting, but it's not bad. Like, it's in the murky middle, but everything that could have gone wrong this year basically went wrong, right? I mean, from Towns and Gobert playing less than 500 minutes on the floor with Anthony Edwards, to the Towns injury in and of itself, to constant illness and injury surrounding the team, the bad losing the first play-in game in a collapse sort of situation, the Jaden McDaniels broken hand, the Naz Reid broken wrist. Virtually everything that could have gone wrong this year went wrong. And they still were above 500, got the 8th seed in a difficult conference, and were competitive. We should have won the first play-in game, easily won the second play-in game. We're competitive in a 5-game series against the team that's very likely going to win the championship. So if that's the floor of this team, and Anthony Edwards, who Simmons and Russillo would agree is only going to improve and probably improve rapidly, even if Towns is what he is and Gobert is what he is, assuming this team meshes a little more and Ant eventually makes that John Morant-like leap or whatever it is, well, hopefully in a positive John Morant leap and not the current one that's ongoing, the on-court leap, we'll say that, then like, why is that a bad situation? Yeah, the luxury tax stuff isn't great. They'll make a couple moves. They'll figure that out, but they're not going to get rid of McDaniels. They're not going to get rid of Ant. And also the other thing you have to understand is, well, actually, this is maybe a better segue to some of the other situations, because I want to compare where the Wolves are and where they could be going to some of the other teams that I would say are a much worse situation than Minnesota. And we'll tick off a couple of these teams here, go kind of down the list in the standings, and I'll mention a couple and explain why they're worse situations than Minnesota, and also why the context matters related to the perception of the Timberwolves and why being the GM of the Timberwolves would not be the worst gig in the world. Because, I mean, number one, Anthony Edwards, but a number of other reasons too. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right, the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers will be back again tomorrow on Friday and next week, Monday through Friday, and we'll get into some more draft conversation, more hypothetical trades, all that good stuff here throughout the offseason as we gear up for what probably is an uneventful draft night here for the Wolves in the next couple of weeks, but you never know. And then, of course, free agency after that, daily through the month of July. So keep it here at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you to those that do make us your first listen every single day. All right. One of the other things you have to consider when you look at GM jobs, context matters. And so if part of the criteria is, as they say it was, I should have mentioned this off the top, but market, right? So you're obviously factoring in talent on the roster, salary cap situation, owner, market, team upside, and basically along with that, I guess, what's the ceiling of where this team could go in this with this particular organization. So for the Wolves, talent on the roster has to be considered really good, much better than a lot of the teams we'll talk about today. Owner, it's better now than it was a couple of years ago, and Glenn Taylor has been an important part of Minnesota basketball history. But I don't unless you want to tie the Gobert trade directly to the new owners, it's hard to give them as a reason why the Wolves shouldn't be good moving forward. Upside of team success with Anthony Edwards and also the ceiling, I think, are both have to be pretty high. The market is maybe not as prohibitive as a lot of national folks like to portray it, simply because there's some upside in the market in terms of it being a basketball town and the actual like DMA, right? Like the actual market itself is really pretty. It's bigger. It's like similar size to Denver, right? Like it's kind of middle of the pack in terms of media markets in the NBA. Now, when you consider as a free agent destination, sure, not great. And then you'd say the same thing about the salary cap situation, which is the biggest issue because it's not a very healthy one, at least not if you want to keep all the players that the Wolves do want to keep. But the context of the situation also matters. For the Wolves to win 47 games a year ago and make threaten to upset the number 2 seed, and then this year to win 42 games, a disappointing step backwards, but consecutive seasons in the playoffs for the first time since 2003 and 2004, consecutive years in the playoffs. First time in 19 years. That context matters. And there's teams in a lot worse situations. If this is the floor for the Wolves, unless something catastrophic happens next year, they're going to be as good or better, and it better be better. Same thing the year after that, right? If you've got Anthony Edwards and you have a baseline top 10 defense with Rudy Gobert, and you hopefully still have Karl-Anthony Towns and you have Jaden McDaniels, how are you possibly going to be worse? And I shouldn't say that out loud. I should know better because, I mean, that's the question we always wonder aloud as followers of the Timberwolves, and the Timberwolves say, hold my beer. Like we are going to be worse because we're the Timberwolves. But like logically speaking, so I guess the way that Russillo and Simmons should be looking at this, how could things get worse next year? If this is the floor, there's worse situations, even if you're in a tough salary cap situation. Other teams that are in worse spots, this is not hard. Like Charlotte, obviously, who I think you could argue that the Timberwolves situations, I mean, clearly they think it's better than the Bulls. I would say it is, but it's closer maybe than certainly closer than it is with Charlotte's. I would say that the Washington Wizards situation is worse. You look at their roster, you look at their cap situation, obviously Bradley Beal, but there's some question marks what happens there. They also owe some future picks. They have their own pick this year, which is 8th. Next year, they owe a future pick to the Knicks that's top 12 protected next year, and then it goes down to top 10 the following year after that. So like it may not convey until 26. And actually, if it doesn't convey in 26, it becomes a second rounder. So they do owe a future pick. They owe a couple of second rounders, but their cap situation is not great. And they don't have a whole lot of like actual top level NBA talent. That's for sure going to be back. Like, obviously they've got some nice pieces. I mean, Kyle Kuzma, Kristaps Porzingis, of course, Bradley Beal, Monty Morris, a good player. But again, the cap situation is what makes things a bit more tenuous. And what do you do with Bradley Beal if you're the Washington Wizards? So for me, that, and of course they have a new front office leader now. They just hired away the Clippers, former Clippers GM to be their president of basketball ops. That was, of course, a job that was rumored to be on the radar of Tim Connolly, who's from that area. And, at least some folks thought that there was a chance that Tim Connolly could flee Minnesota after 1 year, which is what that would be had he left. Could end up in Washington, but that's a worse situation. Like, again, yes, future picks, great. They've got more than Minnesota, but they still owe a future pick. Theoretically, they're a free agent destination more so than Minnesota simply because it's DC. It's a bit more in the spotlight, or at least it would be if they were good. So yeah, there's certainly some upside there. You get one more year of Kristaps Porzingis before he becomes a free agent. One more year of Kyle Kuzma at $13 million. So I guess in that sense, it's not a bad cap spot, but it's not like they have a ton of trade assets that you know what to do with, or are easy to make a decision on, right? Like, you'd love to bring Kyle Kuzma back, but he's going to want more money than $13 million. So do you trade him? What's the decision look like there? So it's a different cap situation, but I would still rather be in the Timberwolves situation with 3 stars than in the Wizards situation with 1 star and 2 almost stars in Porzingis at this stage of his career and Kyle Kuzma. I would say the Wizards are in a worse spot than Minnesota. Orlando, you'd probably argue, is in a better spot only really because of Paolo Banchero. If they didn't have Banchero, things were feeling pretty gloomy there a year ago in Orlando because of coming out of the bubble season. Everyone thought with Jonathan Isaac, what could they be? And then injuries, et cetera. And they, kind of essentially nosedived or took a giant step backwards. You could argue they're in a better spot now. I don't love the Pacers spot. Obviously, I love Tyrese Halliburton, but I don't love their spot. You could argue them. For me, the most obvious team that I think is in a worse position than Minnesota is the Atlanta Hawks. The Atlanta Hawks, they also owe some future first-round picks. Their cap situation with, go to Trae Young as a player that is rumored to be being shopped. John Collins has been shopped now for at least 2. It was like going back to the start of COVID when it was talked about that John Collins could be a trade target for the Wolves before he signed an extension. Those guys are available. They have Clint Capella for 2 more years. DeAndre Hunter, who's a really good player, I think DeAndre Hunter is a solid player, but given what he's being paid, which is he signed a 4-year, $90 million extension, they also owe 3+ years on Bogdan Bogdanović. Like, the cap sheet is a mess for Atlanta. Plus, you add in the picks that they owe. They do have their own pick this year. They also have their own pick next year, and potentially a late first-round pick from the Kings. But they owe their 25 pick to San Antonio. They have a pick swap in 26 with San Antonio and own their 27 to San Antonio because of the DeJounte Murray trade. So you're talking a lack of future picks. You're talking a max deal to Trae Young, which includes the next 3 years plus the player option on the 4th year. So effectively 4 years, all over $40 million for a star who is a star, but, a limited star. And in a lot of ways, there's similarities between Karl-Anthony Towns and Trae Young. We're not going to get into that now. But that's the Trae Young situation, the possibility he could be traded, but I don't think he's worth more to any other team than he is to Atlanta. And then John Collins, do they trade John Collins? Are they able to trade John Collins? I don't see how this situation is better than the Wolves. And then you want to look at the standings. I mean, they obviously had that a little bit of a late season. They showed some life with Quinn Snyder at the helm there, but they still only won 41 games. They're still a game worse than Minnesota. And there's not really real light at the end of the tunnel if you're the Atlanta Hawks, in my mind. The star power, at least there's some, but I don't think anyone could argue with a straight face that you'd rather have, especially factoring in current contracts, Trae Young, John Collins, and Clint Capella, DeAndre Hunter, throw in Bogdanović over the Timberwolves 5 that they owe money to in Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, even those 4, like, you would argue, I think that the Wolves, I certainly would, that the Wolves core there, who they're owing money to, is a better core to owe money to. And yeah, they owe a couple of additional first-round picks, but like, you'd rather have Ant than anybody in that conversation. I could argue I'd rather have Karl-Anthony Towns than Trae Young or John Collins. You could argue you'd rather have Rudy Gobert than, well, I guess it'd be hard to argue. I suppose Capella only has the 2 years left on his deal. So I guess maybe maybe you'd rather have Clint Capella at 2 years and $45 million than Gobert at 4 years and whatever it is he's owed over the next 4 years. But the point still stands. The Atlanta situation is a worse one compared to the Timberwolves. I want to mention a couple other teams here and just kind of like put a bow on this kind of silly, silly debate, if you will, I guess, that was brought up by the Ringer here in just a minute. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Birddogs. Birddogs, put simply, they just make you look good. Birddogs are stretch khaki shorts that are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon does, but they actually fit way better. They fit better than regular shorts that are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki material, but stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. Also, by the way, I'll talk about this again in a minute, but you get a Yeti style cooler with your order if you use our promo code. I love wearing my Birddogs all weekend long. I mean, I can wear them to the store if I run to the store Saturday morning, come home, hang out in the house with the kids all day, go in the backyard, grill, sit by the pool, whatever, and wear Birddogs. You can run to the store in them. They've got pockets in them, so they're comfortable. They feel like gym shorts, athletic shorts, basketball shorts, but they have actual pockets, and they look a little more presentable to wear in public. Whatever it is, whatever errands you're running, it's the best of all worlds. Absolutely. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. Enter promo code LockedOnNBA for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. Again, that's birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you. All right, so back to this idea that the Wolves are the third worst GM job to have in the NBA. So I've already mentioned, obviously, Charlotte. I would also agree with Chicago are worse situations. I would say that the Atlanta Hawks are absolutely a worse situation. I could make an argument for the Pacers. I think you can still make an argument for Detroit. I get that. Now they have a different coaching situation too, but like Cade Cunningham, great, but is anybody excited about where the Pistons actually are? They also owe some future picks. I mean, they have a protected pick that they owe to the Knicks. The protections change a bit over time, so I guess that's the only one that they really owe, but they owe a future pick. And given how bad they've been the last few years, they're not in a great spot. I just don't know. Here's the basis of the argument, and here's kind of my point, without going down like the list of future picks owed for all these teams. What are GMs chasing? Obviously championships, but what do you need to get championships? And because only one team can win the finals every year, what are they chasing? They're chasing superstars, transcendent players, all-star, and all-stars, right? The Timberwolves have at least very likely one transcendent type player, right? Anthony Edwards, everyone would agree, has the capability of being that. In fact, even Simmons and Russillo say this on the show, and it's why Simmons is so surprised when Russillo drafts Minnesota as the third worst GM job, because they both love Anthony Edwards and they agree, like, the sky really is the limit for Anthony Edwards. And he is exactly what these GMs are chasing. And here he is, not even 22 years old yet. And if you'd rather have Detroit, okay, fine, but they've got to find their Anthony Edwards. If you'd rather be the GM of Washington, fine. they've got to find their Anthony Edwards. It's not Bradley Beal anymore. If you want to have Atlanta, fine. Find an Anthony Edwards with, the 15th pick that they have this year and the cap situation they've got, the future of Trae Young and John Collins very much in question with the franchise. You could do all of those things, but just know, that's the point, right? The point, what they're trying to do is what the Wolves already have, which is Anthony Edwards. Layer into that, that's number one, 1A, 1B, 1C, it's everything. But layer into that, you still have Karl-Anthony Towns. And even if the Timberwolves decide he doesn't fit moving forward, Karl-Anthony Towns is a positive trade asset. I've talked about this forever on the show. Howard Beck talked about this a couple weeks ago when he was on the show. Karl-Anthony Towns is worth a lot on the open market. They may not be able to get all the picks back that they traded in the Gobert trade. I don't think they will. But they'll get a couple, and they'll get some players. They have a positive trade asset in Karl-Anthony Towns. They have one of the biggest budding young superstars in the NBA in Anthony Edwards. They have arguably the best perimeter defender in the league in Jaden McDaniels, still on a rookie deal for another season. And Mike Conley's not a bad contract with only 1 year left. So the only, quote unquote, bad deal you have is Rudy Gobert, who is still an all-star caliber defender, and I think will be better next year than he was this year. It's really just a problem of, does Ant break through? If he breaks through, if Ant does what people think Ant can do, this is suddenly a 50-win team, and we're talking about a top 4 seed. I mean, think about how razor thin that margin is. I could even make an argument that I don't love the Kings standing. The Kings only finished 6 games ahead of the Wolves. I know it feels like they finished 12, 14 games ahead of the Wolves, but they only finished 6 games ahead of the Wolves this year. And De'Aaron Fox, yeah, he was great. I'm not arguing that the Wolves are actually in a better spot than the Kings. The point I'm making is that the margin is razor thin. And when everyone's striving for the same thing, which is transcendent superstar players, and the Wolves have one of those guys, they have one of the top, call it 10 trade assets in the league in Anthony Edwards, if that's how you want to look at it, why would you ever argue that the Wolves are in the third worst situation? The Karl-Anthony Towns pivot after the Rudy Gobert trade is a very real thing, and the Timberwolves could choose to do that and have success doing that. And that's why I think it's just patently absurd to put them in the same boat as Charlotte and Chicago, and ahead of the likes of Atlanta and Washington and Detroit and, these other teams that really should be in the conversation. Didn't even talk about Houston. Obviously, the market helps them there, and they've got some picks, but the core of that roster, I mean, what core, right? Dallas, obviously Luka Doncic, but they're in an awful spot from a cap perspective, from a picks perspective. I think you'd rather be there because you have Luka, right? But you got to, what's your next step? You're running out of time to figure that thing out around Luka, as weird as that sounds. The Wolves have time to figure it out with Anthony Edwards. He hasn't signed the rookie extension yet, the max extension. So there's aspects about the Timberwolves job that should be far more attractive than many of these other jobs out there. And obviously, this is a completely hypothetical conversation. But Anthony Edwards is what these other GMs are looking for. So why why would the Wolves be considered the third worst potential GM job? It's a completely fabricated hypothetical by Russillo and Simmons, but I think it's a pretty good overreaction to, and I talked about this a few weeks ago, that the Wolves are just kind of everybody says, well, the Wolves are the worst now because of the Gobert trade, and that misses the point. Misses an entire season of basketball where Towns missed 52 straight games and they still won 42 games and were competitive in the playoffs. Didn't even get the chance to work on what they traded all those assets for. So I think, as I've said many times on the show, criticism is fair. Just because they made a trade, they overpaid for Rudy Gobert, doesn't mean that every resulting or successive decision is the worst decision and they're automatically the worst franchise and you'd never want to be their GM. I just think it's lazy is a word that I could use to describe it. I just think it's not an accurate representation of what the job the assets the Wolves have, the players on the roster. I just don't think it accurately represents it when there's so many other teams that are in a much worse position from a talent perspective. And that should outweigh all the market. It should outweigh even future picks, all that stuff. I just thought it was a pretty poor argument made on that show. All right. That's all we have for you today here on the show. We'll, of course, be back on Friday. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.